Greetings! Good to have you back, guys. We're going to continue with chapter 3.1, our chapter on the ancient world, and we are now moving to ancient Greece. So as a recap, we spent the first parts of this lecture talking about the prehistoric world, the Paleolithic and Neolithic art created by our ancient ancestors. Then we looked at the art of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And now we're moving to the Greeks and the Romans. So that's what we're going to be talking about for this lecture. If I can get the slide to change. Magic! Okay, so here's a map of ancient Greece. Down here is Egypt. So if you kind of want to know where we are, we're still very close to the world that we have been before. If we just headed a little more, to the east, you would see Mesopotamia right off the corner of our map here. So we're still within the realm and the sphere of influence of the cultures we've been studying. We're just on sort of the other side of the Mediterranean here and looking at the Aegean Sea. So, first of all, before we get to the Greeks, I want to talk really quickly about a culture called the Minoans. The Minoans were an ancient culture that were living in ancient Greece a good 600 years before the Greeks even arrived. They lived on an island called Crete. And there are many who believe that this culture is the source for the myths and legends of King Minos and the Minotaur, the bull-headed creature that lived at the center of a labyrinth, and the story of the great Greek hero Theseus. But we're not going to spend a lot of time here. But if we're looking at the art of this period, this is probably the image that we're going to choose if we only got to choose one. This is from the island of Crete. This is from the Minoan civilization, and this is a fresco. Frescoes, as you guys know, are paintings made with plaster. The ancient Minoans made numerous frescoes, and they filled their cities and buildings with these things. This is one of the most famous, although it is mostly a reconstruction. Sort of the lighter pieces that you're seeing are actually added much later. But this is a fascinating image to me because here we have an image of a bull. That is the symbol of traditional male power that we have seen since the very, very beginning of really the production of images. But here we see images of two women, priestesses probably, who are controlling this bull. One literally has the bull by the horns. And then you see a male figure sort of leaping over this bull. This is probably a part of either an entertainment or a religious ritual or kind of a mixture of the two. Think about modern day passion plays and stuff. Those are religious ceremony. They have a ceremonial function. They're meant to instruct and tell stories from the Bible, but they're also there to entertain. So this could be something along those lines with sort of acrobatics involved. What I also find fascinating about this image are the way the women are depicted compared to the men. The women have white skin and the men have brown skin. This is probably just a shorthand of cluing the viewer in that we are looking at two different genders, men and women. The Minoans weren't probably not, the men weren't of sort of one ethnic heritage and the women of another. That would be genetically sort of impossible. But it is possible that women spent more times indoors and men spent more times outdoors, and so men maybe had darker skin, and then this was exaggerated in the depiction of men and women. But what is fascinating here is this sort of strength that is shown in the women. Also, you'll notice that even though we are seeing some composite figures here, as we saw in ancient Egypt, the figures are a lot more relaxed and lifelike and realistic than we saw in Egyptian art. So even though the Minoans would have had contact with ancient Egypt, they're not far from Egypt at all, and certainly there would have been trade and other kinds of interactions with this much older culture and certainly a lot of influence from Egypt, you can see that the Minoans were very much doing their own thing. So eventually the Minoans and other peoples living in what is today Greece disappear. This could have been caused by disease, this could have been caused by volcanic eruptions, earthquakes. There are several different theories about what led to the loss of these people. Warfare, probably a combination of various factors is really what we're looking at. But by the, 1000 BC or so, this ancient Minoan civilization is more or less gone. And we start to see the rise of a new people, what we call the Greeks. Now, the Greeks are... we're not exactly sure where they came from. There's scholars who are much more knowledgeable in this subject that will provide fairly different, convincing arguments. But what's important to us is you have this new people. And eventually, this younger culture that is in this ancient area, let's go back to our map. Our younger culture here, that is settling here on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, say that 10 times real fast, are very close to Egypt. Right under me here. Here, let's move me over here. Right here. So there's a lot of contact and a connection to the ancient Egyptians. And as this new culture, the Greeks, or they called themselves the Hellenes, actually, as the Hellenes were sort of getting their stuff together and creating a culture and an identity, they borrowed heavily from Egypt. And we can see that in some early Greek sculpture from a period we call the Archaic, which is just a fancy way of saying old. This is art and architecture that was produced in the 6th century BC. And so these two statues, the one on the left and the one in the middle, are examples of an archaic Greek sculpture called a chorus. Chorus literally means boy or young man. And these were statues of men that were used often as memorials, as used as grave markers, sometimes used associated with temples. But they were kind of a general function sort of sculpture, but often made to honor somebody. And you can see there's a heavy influence from ancient Egyptian art. You can see that in the position of the body. You can see that even in the hairstyle. The Greeks borrowed heavily from the Egyptian clothing, or style, I should say. You can see that in the left foot sort of coming out here. I call this the Egyptian hokey pokey. It's a very common trope that you see in Egyptian art. These figures with the left foot coming out, sort of meaning to kind of imply movement. It's always the left foot, probably because that's the side that the heart is on, and it relates to life and movement. There's all sorts of theories about why. But what's important is that you're seeing that the Greeks are taken heavily from the Egyptians, which the Egyptians at this point had been around for a good 2,500 years. They were already an ancient culture, and to the ancient Greeks, and so their influence is huge. But you can see there's some key differences. First of all, the Greek statues are nude, and this has a lot to do with how the Greeks viewed themselves and they viewed humanity. Okay, and this is really important. The Greeks had a philosophy, a worldview, a sort of way of looking at things called humanism. And humanism is, if you could sort of sum it up, the ancient Greeks said, man is the measure of all things. But what humanism is really is sort of like a human-centered view of the world. That you see things through human eyes. You see things through sympathy and empathy. Man is, by the Greeks, was considered to be the greatest of the gods' creations. In fact, the Greeks believed that that human beings were modeled on the gods, that we looked pretty much just like the gods. And so this is different than other ancient belief systems whose gods were often non-human in appearance. You think about the ancient Egyptian gods, and they had, the heads of dogs and jackals, and, pardon me, various birds and cats and things like that. But in the Greek culture, humans and gods aren't that different from each other. They also believe that being human was a gift, and this is really important. Being human is a gift. And one of the gifts that come with being human is our ability to improve ourselves and to become the best possible human we can become. And so we have, in this sort of humanist worldview, for the ancient Greeks, we have an obligation to the gods to become better people, physically and mentally. And then if we strive for that mental and physical perfection, moral perfection will follow. Okay, so there's this idea of constant improvement. Okay, so in Greek sculpture, you will always see the human being portrayed nude. Well, you will see men portrayed nude because men, the Greeks believed that men were the best. Sorry, ladies, your nudity in Greek art will come later, but it will come. Okay, so this class is really weird sometimes, isn't it? So you want to show off that awesome body that the gods have given you. The other thing is, Greeks generally showed their figures to be perfect and strong and muscular and athletic, because the idea is you are constantly improving yourself. Humanism is, man is awesome, right? Man has this ability to make ourselves better, and if we don't make ourselves better, then we have squandered this awesome gift. So, we see nude figures. The Greeks also generally painted their statues. This is hard to see today as the paint has generally worn off. To make things worse, when art history as a sort of discipline and archaeology as a discipline in the 17 and 1800s first started to really kickstart and get started, a lot of the early historians and archaeologists removed the paint, thinking it was dirt or thinking that the Greek statues just looked better all white, when they weren't. They often had skin tone, and they often had darker skin tone. So we can reconstruct what these images look like because of little flecks of paint still attached to the sculpture. Okay, so let's look at these two chorus figures. And these are both, these are about 60, 70 years apart, something like that. And if you look closely, you can see that there is a difference between these two. The one that's later, this statue of a guy named Croesus, is a lot more realistic. And they're both in many ways more realistic than the Egyptian sculpture. Why? Because there's a desire to show musculature. There's a desire to show the muscles under the skin. And the Greeks started to become really obsessed with this, with realism. And they're going to strive to make their sculptures look more and more real. Why real? Because they want the world to look like the way human beings see the world, right? They want this human-centric view of the world. And how do we see things? Well, we see things realistically, right? They want to recreate human vision because this is a humanistic society. Also, look at the faces. That funny, goofy, Greek archaic face. This goofy smile is known as the archaic smile. The Greeks really wanted to show emotion in their art because that's part of human individuality, isn't it? That's part of the human experience, is expressing emotion, and this humanist society wanted to do that. Now, they didn't quite get it right. The smile looks weird because the cheeks don't move with the smile, because the Greeks were still learning how muscles worked. Also, the eyes tend to sort of bulge out. And this was meant to show life. This was meant to show a soul. This was meant to show individuality and emotion. But once again, they didn't quite get it right. You can also see that in many cases the muscles look kind of generic. They were still learning, but they're getting better and better and better. The Greeks produced a lot of paintings. Unfortunately, a lot of that we don't have because it was painted on wood. What we do have that survived were vases. And in fact, Greek vases were very, very famous all around the ancient Mediterranean world, and especially those from Athens. But really, a lot of different places in Greece produced pottery. And in fact, the Greek potters were more famous than the people who painted the pottery. But that being said, we're going to look at a Greek vase painter named Exekias. And Exekias, first of all, we have an artist whose name we know. In fact, many of the ancient Greek artists, their names were very well known. And this is really the first society, at least in the Western world, who promoted this idea of the identity of the artist. Why? Because this is a humanist society, and human achievement counts now, right? You want to know who made these amazing, beautiful things because you want to give them the respect and adoration that they deserve for their achievement, for making this incredible thing after working hard and improving themselves and becoming better artists. This is all part of the humanist thing. And so let's take a look at this pot. This is a technique called the black figure technique. It's a very difficult technique to do. It's very similar in some ways to the blackware technique we saw earlier when we looked at the pottery in the craft chapter. But you'll notice some of these figures look like basically like silhouettes. And this is caused by painting the image with slip, which you know is a watery clay, onto the surface, and then basically injecting smoke into the firing process while this thing is in the kiln. But you have to do it for a certain length of time, only at certain temperatures. You can only allow a certain volume of smoke in. It's a very difficult technique to do. But when it's achieved correctly, it's really this very, very beautiful technique, as you can see. So let's look very quickly at an image on the right. This is what Greek pottery looked like before Exekias and before the Archaic period. And you can see in many ways it looks like a lot of the other art we've seen from Egypt and Mesopotamia. The figures are small and they're broken into these different, what we call registers, these individual bands, and they're rather abstract kinds of characters. But with Greek pottery, we get widescreen. The artist zooms in on the human action. And so what we're looking at is a scene from the great Greek myth, or great Greek poem by the poet Homer, the Iliad, and one of his two big works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this is the story of Achilles and Ajax, who are fighting in the Trojan War. And as you guys know, the Trojan War lasted for years and years and years. And it was basically a stalemate. Neither side, the Trojans nor the Greeks, could actually win this war. And it almost became like a job to these soldiers who would get up every morning and go back to the battlefield and fight. And so what we're basically seeing is a lunch break. We're seeing the two of the great Greek heroes, Achilles and Ajax, basically playing a game of draughts, a game of more or less checkers. And notice how Exekias has zoomed in on the action and gotten rid of any sort of information in the background that's not important, which is unlike really any other art we've seen before. We haven't seen an artist sort of zoom in and really focus in on what characters are doing and how they're behaving as individual humans. But now that we're in the realm of humanism, we're seeing that. And we can see that, we're given a lot of information here. These guys are still so in the middle of this war that they haven't even put their spears down. Achilles still has his helmet propped up on his head, and their shields are leaned up right behind them, ready to go and be grabbed at a moment's notice. So these are guys who are literally still engaged in battle, but they're just taking a break. And that in itself is a very human moment. This, despite sort of the terror and the horrors of these guys' life, besides the hardship, they have this moment for this sort of quiet interaction between friends. and it's rather quite moving in a way. This image also, if you know the story, and all the ancient Greeks would have known the story of what's going to happen, adds a layer of tragedy. That not long after this moment, Achilles is going to be killed by the Trojan hero Hector, and Ajax is going to claim his armor, but he's not going to get it. And this causes mixed emotions because he's lost his friend, but they were also rivals too. Achilles and Ajax had this sort of they were frenemies in a way. They were both sort of badasses, and they both had respect for each other, but they also both wanted to be the best warrior. And so Ajax is sort of distraught by the loss of his friend and by this feeling of being snubbed, and eventually he will commit suicide. In fact, on the other side of this pot, which you can't see, is the image of that suicide. So we know that this war, these years and years and years of war, will ultimately lead to tragedy. And that adds a certain layer of sadness onto this. So this kind of human emotion, this focusing in on everyday people, or in this case everyday heroes, but sort of people's normal everyday behavior and their loves and losses and friendships, is a whole new thing, guys. And the Greeks are bringing us this, zooming in, larger than life, kind of technicolor version of this kind of human interaction. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so let's talk about Athens, because we can't talk about ancient Greece without talking about the power of the Athenians. Athens was the most powerful of all the Greek city-states. Greece was divided into a bunch of different smaller city-states who all ruled themselves. The Athenians formed a democracy with which to rule. Some Greek city-states were still ruled by a king, but not Athens. Athens, in fact, really invents this concept of democracy. In fact, democracy is a Greek word. Demos is the Greek word for people. Krasi is the word for rule. So we're seeing a humanistic form of government, because the Greeks believed that everybody's opinion counted, or at least land-holding men. But still, this is better than what came before, because most other ancient civilizations were ruled by kings or priests or a combination thereof. And the idea is that they are ruled by a higher authority, by the gods or by the pharaoh or the king or the priest or whatever it was. And normal, everyday human beings didn't matter. But for the Greeks, if we are made in the image of the gods, and we're given all this incredible ability of self-improvement and insight and all this stuff, then we have the right to rule ourselves and make decisions for ourselves as human beings. This is part of humanism, guys. And so they invent democracy, this way where everybody gets a vote, in electing leaders and making decisions for the city, yada, yada, yada. Okay. So we are looking at a Greek temple sitting on a mountain, or really a rocky outcropping, if we want to be technically correct here. The outcropping, the rock, is called the Acropolis, literally meaning high place. And on top of it is a building called the Parthenon, and actually several other buildings that were used by the ancient Greeks, or the ancient Athenians, as a temple, but also as a treasury and as government buildings. So this is literally the center of town, both kind of, geographically, but also spiritually, politically, in every sort of way. Okay. So let's talk, before we talk about this, let's talk about a guy, let's talk about the Persians, and let's talk about the Persian War, because we can't understand the Acropolis, we can't understand ancient Greeks and Athens especially without looking at this. So I'm going to sum up a very complex historical events in like 30 seconds. So the Persian Empire was the largest empire in the world. It spread from basically modern-day Iran, bordering on India, through the Middle East, North Africa, through modern-day Turkey, and into ancient Macedonia and southern Europe. All right. Powerful empire, largest empire in the world. And In many cases, their conquest of the Persian Empire were fairly easy because the Persian Empire would say, hey guys, we want to conquer you, but before you say no, we're going to, think about it. We're the largest empire in the world. We can provide trade, we can provide income, we can provide military protection and police forces and roads and all these other really cool things that come with being part of an empire. And a lot of people just went, oh, okay, fine. We'll become part of the Persian Empire. And it was very much this sort of international, multicultural empire with lots of different cultures and languages and all this sort of stuff. And they wanted Greece. Because if you have access to Greece, you have access to the rest of the Mediterranean and Western Europe. But the Greeks didn't want any part of this because the Greeks were not quite isolationist, but they certainly were very sort of Greek-centric, and they didn't really want to be part of the Persian Empire. If the Greeks believed that man was the measure of all things, the Greeks believed that Greeks were the measure of all men. And everybody else to the Greeks literally was a barbarian. And they didn't want to be part of those cultures. So the Greeks decided to band and unite together and fight off the Persians. This in itself was an amazing feat because the Greek city-states were constantly fighting. And to get them to stop fighting each other, to fight somebody else, was actually pretty hard to do, pretty cool. And so they unite, and in the year 490, at the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks win over the Persian army. 10 years later, the Persians come back, this time even more angry, and they really want to conquer the Greeks. And this time it's personal. And the Persian ruler Xerxes, if you've ever seen the movie 300, a lot of this is covered in that film, invades Greece again. He is held off by the Spartans, and that is what the movie 300 is about, at the Battle of Thermopylae. But what's really important is Athens. The Athenian navy comes up behind the Persian navy and decimates them. So twice in 10 years, little tiny Greece held off the largest empire in the world. So you can imagine the feelings that the Greeks have about themselves after this. If they were already pretty proud of themselves, they were super proud after this. And so there's this real feeling of Greek superiority. So the Greeks decide eventually to rebuild the temple in Athens that was destroyed during the Persian Wars. Okay. And the temple that they decide to rebuild is called the Parthenon. It's a temple to the goddess Athena, the goddess of Athens. Athena was also a warrior goddess. She was the goddess of wisdom, and she was thought to give the Greeks their the gift of the olive tree, which was the source of, or to give the Athenians the olive tree, which is the source of a lot of Athenian power and trade. So they build this building called the Parthenon, dedicated to the goddess Athena. It is what we call a Doric temple. Let's go here. So there are basically three kinds of what we call orders of Greek art. There's the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And I want you guys to know these, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. I want you to be able to recognize them on a test. The Doric, the easiest way to determine the Doric is the simplicity of what's called the capital, the top of the column. It's a very simple stripped down capital, whereas the Ionic has these little curlicues that we call volutes, and the Corinthian has what are called acanthus leaves. These are all named for different city-states in ancient Greece, and the Corinthian is the oldest, and the Doric is the oldest, and the Corinthian is the newest of the three. Okay, the other way to determine the Doric is up on the frieze here. They have what's known as the entablature, this entire sort of area. They have two little areas called triglyphs and metopes. Triglyph meaning three marks, literally, triglyphs, alternate between these square areas called metopes. And in these metopes, generally, you'll see small relief sculpture. So if you want to see a Doric, it has this very simple capital, and it has alternating triglyphs and metopes. The other two, the Ionic and the Corinthian, are basically almost identical. In fact, some historians say the Ionic and Corinthian are really just variations of each other. Corinthian is just a kind of Ionic. I don't care. But what really matters is, being able to tell the difference in the columns. Okay. A typical Greek temple is rectangular. It is often called a peristyle, P-E-R-I-S-T-Y-L-E, peristyle temple, because there is a column or row of columns, or what is called a colonnade, around the perimeter of the temple. Okay, on the ends of the temple are triangular areas called pediments, and inside these pediments you will also see sculpture. And so that's what we see in the ancient Greek sculpture, ancient Greek temples. I want to point something out here, and this is something I forgot to mention earlier. Greek architecture and Greek sculpture was painted. The Greeks liked realism. They wanted their sculptures to look real. So I think I did mention this actually, so never mind. They were painted, though, to look real, and that goes with the architecture as well as freestanding sculpture. Okay, so alongside the outside of the Parthenon, in the metopes, these little square areas next to the triglyphs, so right here, are images of war, various battles between the ancient Greek gods and monsters. This was meant to represent the Athenian victory over the Persians, to have these various mythological battles of the gods, in other words, the Athenians, winning over the monsters, aka the Persians. It was meant to show Athenian victory and superiority over the Persians who they conquered. Take a look at this sculpture. This would have been painted, so paint it in your mind. But notice we have, yes, the nude figure, because this is ancient Greece, and humans are awesome, so we'll show them naked. But look at the realism here. Look at the musculature. Look at the positions of the body. Art is becoming more and more and more realistic, because now we have entered a period called the classical period. So we've moved away from the archaic, and now here in the 5th and 4th centuries, we're going to be seeing a period called the classical with a capital C, where Greek art really reached its height in terms of realism, in terms of beauty. We've reached this classical period. Inside the Parthenon is a sculpture of Athena that was 40 feet tall and covered in golden garments. This is typical of Greek temples. The Greeks believed these statues held the spirit, really, of the god. So when you look at this statue, you're not looking at a statue of Athena, you're looking at Athena. And also you'll see in her hand is a winged figure. This is a Nike. This is an aspect of Athena. The Nikes were these warrior goddesses that soldiers prayed to help them be better in battle. So Nike is, of course, where we get the modern day sports apparel company, because Nike means victory. And the tops of our statues, those winged creatures on the tops of our statues, aren't naked angels. Those are Nikes. So if you don't think Greek culture and art has anything to do with modern day, you are absolutely wrong, because it has everything. We got everything from these guys. So every 4 years, there was a festival called the Pananthenaea, or the Panathenaic Festival, that celebrated Athena. And there was a sacrifice of a bull. Oh, bulls! Bulls are everywhere in the ancient world, aren't they? Because bulls are powerful. And every 4 years there's this big festival held. A guy named Phidias designed the entire top of the Acropolis, the Parthenon, and all of these other smaller buildings, temples and other buildings here. And he designed it as a way of accommodating this massive festival that occurred every 4 years. Okay. The last thing I want to show you is the inside frieze. So let's go back here. Inside, behind the colonnade, along this walkway here, we see images, we see sculptures, low relief sculptures of the Athenians themselves. Keep this in mind. The Athenians put themselves on the top of their temple at the same level of the gods. If you don't think that the Athenians thought highly of themselves, think about this. Think about like at a modern day Christian church, if the congregation had themselves painted on the outside, sitting alongside God or Christ, you'd be like, whoa, they think pretty highly of themselves, don't they? Yeah. So did the ancient Athenians. Absolutely did. And they put themselves at the same level of the gods. Okay. We're gonna... Yeah, let's not worry about that. Let's talk now about... I'm gonna put myself over here for a second. Hello. Let's talk now about some classical sculpture. So the image on the left is a Greek archaic chorus figure. The image on the right is a classical sculpture by an artist named Polykleitos. This is a figure we call the Doryphorus, or the spear bearer, although Polykleitos would have called it the canon. A canon is a set of rules or standards, right? You've probably heard that if you're a geek, if you're into like Star Wars or whatever, you've probably heard the term canon, Harry Potter or whatever. And something that is canon means that it's official, right? Something that is not canon means it's not part of the actual official story. And so canon comes from this term that means rules or regulations. And so this classical sculpture, the spear bearer, or what Polykleitos would have called the canon, was meant to serve as sort of the standard for all sculpture, in terms of proportion, in terms of its perfection. And Polykleitos introduced something called contrapposto. This literally means counterbalance. And if you look at this sculpture, you can see that it has this slight S-curve to its spine. And one hip is higher than the other. One half of the body is engaged in action, the other half is at rest. Polykleitos believed this was the most perfect way to show the human body. Divided up easily into 4 quadrants, and then to set half of those quadrants in motion and half of them at rest, as a way of showing off the human body and dividing it into 4 sort of perfect parts. The Greeks were obsessed with this idea of perfection. Remember, this is the culture that came up with this golden ratio, this golden mean. And they believed that in their quest for perfection, if you wanted to show perfect things, they had to be demonstrated in perfect ratios and perfect proportions. You can also see that this figure is muscular and strong, as all classical Greek sculptures would be, because you want to show off the human body at its best. But also, not only is this a perfect figure in its body, it's perfect in its mind. Look at the thoughtfulness on this athlete's face. This is a thinking man. This is a man who is contemplating deep thoughts here. He's not just some blank, stupid-looking dude. This is a guy who's perfected his mind and his body because he wants to attain greatness. He wants to attain perfection, as all Greeks believe they had a moral obligation to do. Humanism. So eventually, though, the Greeks fall into chaos. And it doesn't take long. The Greek classical period only lasts right under 200 years. And then the Greeks start to, well, return to their old ways, and they start to fight amongst themselves, especially the Spartans and the Greeks, and what are known as the Peloponnesian Wars. And these guys go at it, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until eventually the Spartans win. But by the time the Spartans win, Greece is in shambles, and nobody really wins. And so that leaves open in the 3rd century for a guy from up north, a guy named Alexander the Great from Macedonia, to come in and invade Greece. But Alexander just doesn't want to invade Greece and conquer it. He wants to restore it, because this is a guy who's basically a Greek fanboy. And Alexander wanted to bring Greece back to its glory days. And he does. He restores Athens. He restores many of the great cities from Greece. But Alexander's not done. Alexander keeps marching. And eventually he marches to Egypt. He marches to modern-day Turkey. He marches all the way to India. And everywhere he goes, he sets up new cities, or he restores old cities in a Greek manner. He brings Greek culture everywhere he goes. And we call this period after Alexander the Hellenistic period, because remember the Greeks called themselves Hellenes? Well, we call this period the Hellenistic period because this is where Greek culture is spread. And so we're going to look at a sculpture not made in Greece, actually, made in Rome, but with Greek influence. And this is a sculpture called the Laocoon. And you can see in many ways it has a lot of similarities to Greek classical sculpture, muscular nude bodies, etc., etc. But what makes this sculpture different, I'm moving myself down here now, is the drama. Greek classical sculpture is very, well, not boring, but reserved. Because the idea is you're trying to reach perfection. And you don't reach perfection by being an idiot. You don't reach perfection by being overly emotional. You exert control. And so that's why classical Greek sculpture is filled with a bunch of naked dudes standing around looking awesome and thoughtful. Because the idea is you've kind of reached this sort of stage of perfection. But in the Hellenistic period, we get drama. We get deep emotion. We get violence. We get sexuality. We get all these sort of extremes. Why? Because these are extreme times. This is a culture that has experienced civil war, violent, ravaging civil war, and then experienced conquest. And so a conquest by one of the great sort of heroes, military minds ever. So this is a time of great deeds, of great heroes, of great failures, of great victories. This is an emotional time in history, and boy, oh boy, is the Hellenistic art emotional. So let's talk about the sculpture called the Laocoon, which was dug up actually during the time of Michelangelo, during the Renaissance. So 2,000 years later, almost, this thing was rediscovered. And basically, Michelangelo said, I know nothing. The ancient Greeks were doing amazing things thousands of years before I was. This was dug up in Rome. And it tells the story of Laocoon, who is an advisor to the king of Troy during the Trojan Wars. And basically, he warns the king about the Trojan horse and says, I don't think this is a good idea. We should not take this horse in. It's a trap. And the king and everybody else in Troy says, no, it's fine. We just want the war to be over. The Greeks have surrendered. We're gonna bring this horse in. It's a victory. It's a gift, by the Greeks, showing us that we have won, and we're going to take this thing in. Of course, it's a trap. The Greek hero Odysseus has basically hidden inside with some men inside the horse. Laocoon, this advisor to the king, says, no, we shouldn't do this. Let's not bring this horse in. Nobody believes him, and Laocoon says, all right, I'm out of here. Sure enough, Laocoon leaves, and as he's escaping with his sons, after a big party, all of the Trojans are passed out asleep from drinking, and Odysseus and his men get out of the horse, open the gates, and the entire Greek army comes in and kills the Trojans while they're sleeping and sets Troy on fire. Now, Laocoon is like, whew, this sucks. I do not like this at all. My home is gone. My friends are gone. And everything's on fire. But at least I escaped. But then, the god Poseidon shows up and says, you know what? Laocoon, you almost blew this whole thing for my boys, the Greeks, because Poseidon was on the side of the Greeks. And he's like, and you know what I'm going to do to punish you? I'm going to make you hurt really, really badly. And he takes Laocoon and he takes his children and he opens up this hole in the ocean, and out emerges this ancient and evil sea serpent, and it slowly devours Laocoon and his son. The moral of the story: never anger a Greek god, or it will come to bite you in the ass. Literally. Okay, so what I want you guys to get from this Hellenistic sculpture is emotion, is intensity, is movement. Where Greek sculptures often stand kind of still. They just, they're being smart and they're being perfect. But in Hellenistic art, we get movement, bodies that twist and turn, faces that portray extreme feeling and emotion. Is what we're seeing here. It's almost like we're part of this. And also the sculpture is meant to be seen from all angles. You can't get this entire story unless you see it from multiple angles. So emotion, movement, and being viewed from multiple angles are key elements of the Hellenistic. I want to talk very quickly about the Aphrodite of Cnidus, and it is an image of Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and love. But the Greeks initially, their sculptures of women were clothed because they only believed that men kind of deserved to be seen nude because men were awesome. But this starts to sort of get a little more, these rules start to soften up, and by the time we get to the end of the classical and into the Hellenistic, we do see nude figures. So this is significant for that reason. It's also significant for its sensuality and its eroticism. Traditionally, classical Greek art is pretty reserved. Even though all the sculptures are nude, they don't really portray sexuality. But with the Hellenistic period, we start to see this kind of erotic quality in art of public sculpture. Okay, now that wraps up the Hellenistic. Let's move on to Rome. Moving right along, let's now look at the art of Rome. But before we get to Rome, I want to talk about a culture called the Etruscans very briefly, because the Etruscans were a culture that lived in northern Italy and in many ways were the precursors of the Romans. Etruscan art, think of it as coinciding with Greek archaic and early classical art. This is from a tomb. So the Etruscans were a funerary culture in some ways like the Egyptians, that they buried their dead with elaborate tombs decorated with frescoes, just like the Egyptians did. But the art should appear more Greek here to you. This is called the interior. This is from the Tomb of the Leopards, and it's called that because we see two leopards on either side of a tree. This is actually a version of the heraldic stance. Remember where we saw the guy with the two bulls in ancient Sumer? This is meant to represent the power of this person, with this tree sort of representing his family or his family tree, and either side is a leopard. But here we see an image of a banquet. And this in many ways is very typical of Etruscan art. We often see images of banquets and people eating, but also you'll notice something, how men and women are shown together. In fact, if we look at this image here, you can see something rather remarkable. Men and women almost shown as equals. This is a tomb, or this is a sarcophagus, a kind of a coffin that's made out of terracotta clay, depicting a couple sort of talking at a party, at a gathering. what's going on here? Why is this so weird? Well, the Greeks, and this guy Theopompus was horrified at Etruscan women. He even wrote about how they spoke when they weren't spoken to, and how they were too opinionated, and all this stuff. Because the Greek society is very separated and segmented, and men were very much the dominant part of society. Now, in Etruscan society, men were still sort of the ruling gender, but women had a lot more say. They had a lot more input. They could even own property in some cases. They weren't considered property like Greek women were, and it was in many ways a more equal society. And you can see this in their art and the depiction of women, often side by side with men. And in this case, we see this Etruscan woman gesturing with her hands, talking, really kind of dominating the conversation while her husband sits back. If you look at their faces, though, you can see the Greek influence. The archaic smile and the archaic eyes are quite evident here. So we're very much seeing a Greek influence in Etruscan art, but they're kind of doing their own thing with it. So, moving to Rome. So here is Italy. The Etruscans lived right up in here. Rome's down here. And in fact, at one point, Rome was under Etruscan control. So one reason we look at Etruscan art is because of its influence on Roman art. But you're looking at Rome at its height. There's basically two broad periods of Roman history. There's what we call the Republican period, which lasts up to about up to the 1st century AD. And then there is the imperial period, the Roman Empire, which lasts up into the end of the 400s. So these are two distinct periods. But Rome begins as an empire here in this city, Rome, but eventually it will spread throughout the Mediterranean and the European, African, and Asian worlds and become, at the time, the largest empire in the world. The Romans were heavily influenced by the Greeks. Their art drew heavily from Greek realism. They often depicted their figures nude. They painted their figures sometimes like the Greeks did. And the Romans learned a lot from the Greeks. They often employed Greek teachers for their students, Greek philosophers for their young ones. They admired the Greeks. And Roman art looks a lot like Greek art. What we'll really see is in Roman engineering the big differences between Greek and Roman architecture. But if we look at the art, you can see that there's a lot of similarities. This comes from the end of the Roman Republican period. We see this what's known as a patrician, a father, a head of a household. And no, he's not holding severed heads. But the Romans were really, really, really into ancestor worship. And they really believed that your importance and your power came from your family line and your ancestors. So they even had several holidays where they would take out busts, sculpted heads of their ancestors, and parade them around. And so that is what is happening here. We're seeing a statue of a man holding two statues. But if you look at this sculpture, you can see the realism, especially in the fabric. Obviously, this sculptor has learned heavily from Greek art. One thing you'll notice, though, is that in a lot of Roman art, it's not idealized like the Greeks. The Greeks were about perfection, so all of their statues look perfect. But Roman sculpture has a truthfulness, a verism, a realness to it. Old people look old and have wrinkles, right? People have imperfections in their faces and things like that. You will see that kind of realism in Roman art. You won't see in Greek art. But in most other aspects, Roman art is very much a copy of Greek art. In fact, they often just flat out copy Greek art. In fact, the image that we're seeing here on the left is actually a Roman copy of the Greek classical original, which was originally done in bronze. But Romans tended to prefer marble, so you're going to see a lot more marble sculptures Okay, let's look at some Roman painting. So this comes from the city of Pompeii. Pompeii, of course, in 79 AD, was covered in a blanket of ash after the eruption of the nearby volcano Mount Vesuvius. This was, well, a terrible thing if you were a Pompeian in the year 79 AD, but it's awesome if you were an archaeologist who wanted to get a picture of what Roman life and houses and art and everything else was like in 79 AD, because it basically froze everything in time. This blanket of ash covered everything up and protected it. In the 1700s, there was Pompeii and a sister city called Herculaneum were started to be excavated, and this gives us really an insight into Roman culture from its height that we don't really have access to, because most buildings aren't preserved very, very well, because especially in big cities, buildings are constantly being changed and altered and torn down and added onto. And so even though Rome itself is still an old city and there's a bunch of old stuff there, most of the stuff is not in its original condition. But this gives us that. So one of the things we've discovered from Pompeii are paintings. And there's fresco after fresco after fresco throughout these houses and businesses in Pompeii. This is called a mystery, the Dionysic mystery frieze. This was a religion that worshipped the Greek and Roman god Dionysus, the god of wine. And here we see a ritual being performed. What I want, I don't really care so much what's going on here. What I care about is look at the realism here. Look at the use of chiaroscuro, the use of shading. You guys should know that word. Look at the realistic anatomy of these figures. Also look at the realist three-dimensional space that the artist is trying to create here, even with a little bit of linear perspective. Ooh, look at that. It's not quite linear perspective, it's more kind of a wonky isometric perspective, but the Romans were experimenting with realism in the same way the Greeks were experimenting with realism, because they were a humanist culture and they wanted things to look like the human eye perceives the world. But where the Romans really excel, where the Romans are awesome, is in their engineering. Because think about this. Rome was a massive empire. It spread from Scotland to Baghdad, guys. Scotland to Baghdad. And this is a empire that covered massive cities, from Rome to Carthage to London to, we're looking at major cities, Pergamon, lots of cities. And those cities have lots of people. Rome itself had almost 2 million people at its height. Other cities are in the high hundreds of thousands, edging up on millions of people. And those people need infrastructure. They need roads. They need plumbing. They need schools. They need public buildings. They need apartments. They need parks. They need places to be entertained. They need sports arenas. And all that stuff requires massive structures, and it requires expert engineering. And the Romans brought a new level of expertise to engineering. They built on what had come before. So the Romans are building on the Greeks, and the Greeks are building, of course, on the Egyptians. But if we think about it, let me see. Please work. Well, let's look at the sort of key to Roman art, and that is the arch. So the basic building device that was used through most of the ancient world is something called the post and lintel. And the post and lintel is basically two uprights with a crossbeam. And in most structures, this would have been made with stone, right? And this works really well. The Greeks, built their temples using this device. The Egyptians built their big projects using this device. It's very old, and it works perfectly well. The problem is that if you add too much weight here in the center, eventually this breaks. And you can only build buildings so high if you're building out of traditional stone or brick. But the Romans started using arches. They didn't invent the arch, but they kind of perfected its use. So an arch is, well, The traditional Roman arch is half of a circle. It's a 180-degree structure. It's made up of several stones cut into the shape of trapezoids. These trapezoidal stones are called, it's called a voussoir, or voussoirs is plural. And the central voussoir has a special name. It is called a keystone because it is the keystone into making this arch work. So any pressure coming from above will hit this keystone. But in a post and lintel, instead of hitting that middle and just kind of breaking like that, what we get here is the pressure is pushed outward. It's sublimated. It's distributed outwards and downwards along these other interconnecting voussoirs. And then eventually that hits the pier or the column holding up the arch, and the weight then is moved downward. So what this means is that because the weight is distributed sort of more equally and outwards and downwards, the Romans could build taller structures. And they took this simple little device, this arch, and they tweaked it and created other architectural devices out of it. For example, in the lower left is a barrel vault, which is basically an arch that's just stretched out long ways. Then you could also interconnect these barrel vaults and create what's called a groin vault. A groin is a junction or an intersection. So a groin vault is where several different barrel vaults meet, and this forms a very strong structure here. Or you could add windows and have a fenestrated groin vault. Fenestrate is just a fancy word for windows. Or you can take an arch and you can spin it around this way, 360 degrees, and create a dome. So we're looking at incredible feats of engineering. The Romans also used concrete in their construction. And so the Romans started to build larger structures because they have the use of the arch and the other architectural elements related to the arch, and because of the use of concrete, they could build taller structures. Concrete is lighter than brick. It's less dense. So it means that another reason why you could build things that were way, way bigger than what had come before. And so the Romans made buildings, many of them that are still standing today. In fact, you're looking at a building called the Pantheon, which is the oldest building that is still in use. It was built as a temple, and it's now used as a church and a museum. Pantheon means all the gods. It's dedicated to all the Roman gods. And it's basically two buildings kind of put together. There's a square porch building, and then there is a round building called a rotunda. The front of the structure looks like a Greek temple. So you can see the Greek influence. We have Corinthian columns. I hope you saw those. We have a Greek-style pediment. So very, very, very kind of typical Greek temple. But if you walk inside, you enter a rotunda, which is unlike anything the Greeks had ever built before, because they didn't have the technology for this. And this structure is covered with a dome. And I just talked about how domes are basically like arches. We have a dome that is specially made, though. It is thicker at the bottom, so it tapers and gets thinner at the top. That allows it to hold more weight. The Romans also cut these little notches, or molded these little notches inside the concrete dome, because using these are called coffers, C-O-F-F-E-R-S, and these also help lighten the weight, the load of the dome. And of course, they built the whole thing out of, you guessed it, concrete. They also did something rather weird. They put a hole in the ceiling. This is called an oculus, O-C-U-L-U-S. It means eye. And it has two purposes. One purpose is sort of spiritual. This is a temple dedicated to the gods, so it's an opening into the heavens. But also, it has a structural purpose. Because if you think about it, an arch is... Our dome is just an arch that's been turned 360 degrees. The weakest part of an arch is going to be right at the top. That's going to be your weakest area. So how do you get rid of that pressure? You put a hole in it. You put a hole in the top of that arch, and that means you've removed all downward pressure. So you don't have this extreme weight coming down. Now, it does rain in here, but the Romans thought about that. They were able to control the flow of water and allow the rain to sort of seep outwards and downwards, and there's a series of drainage ditches. But this is an absolutely incredible building. You'll see also that circles and squares dominate. In fact, not only in the coffers with the square-shaped coffers and the circular oculus, but throughout the entire building, squares and circles are everywhere. Also, if you look at the shape of the building itself, it's basically a square and a circle. Why? This is something called sacred geometry, meaning that these shapes represent sort of divine concepts. And the square represents the earth, the four corners of the earth. And the circles or the domes represent the heavens. And so in this temple, this is literally where the heavens and the earth meet, where you come to pray to the gods and communicate with the gods. Circles and squares, the earth and the heavens represented. Last image I want to look at is the last two images is the Arch of Constantine. So Rome eventually becomes Christianized, and in the 4th century, and we'll talk more about the Christianization of Rome in the next chapter, so I'm not skipping over this important part of history. We will get there. But one of the reasons why Rome becomes Christianized is because of an emperor named Constantine, who won a victory at Milvian Bridge. And the story is that this emperor was told that if his soldiers fought under the sign of Christ, they would win. And so he puts this Christian symbol on their shields. They fight against this other person who is wanting to become emperor of Rome, and they are victorious. And this is an example of what's called a triumphal arch. These were built not only to commemorate military victories, but they could commemorate important people or other important sort of events. They weren't just military triumphs, but a lot of them were. This image was meant to commemorate, this piece of architecture was meant to commemorate Constantine's victory over his opponent. You'll notice, though, that there are 3 arches in this arch, and that is to represent the concept of the Trinity, because Constantine's very important because he's the first Christian emperor of Rome. He served as a pagan emperor for most of the rule of most of his rule, but on his deathbed he did convert to Christianity. This sort of represents a transitional period between Christianity and the traditional pagan Roman culture. The last thing I want to take a look at is an equestrian statue. Equestrian meaning relating to horses. This is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the last great emperors of Rome, a philosopher emperor, a man who was influenced by Greek philosophy. That's why he wore a beard, because he wanted to kind of imitate the Greek philosophers. And this is a typical portrait of an emperor, showing him on horseback, showing him sort of leading battle. But there were lots of these created, but only one survived. And it was this one that survived. Marcus Aurelius, we're looking at a bronze sculpture of Marcus Aurelius on horseback. Why did this survive and when all the others didn't? And what happened to them? Well, they were melted down. As I've said before, bronze is a very useful material when you're making things like weapons or building materials or other things. So oftentimes, when things get bad or materials are needed for other purposes, bronze sculptures are the first things melted down. But this remained because of a mistake. Marcus Aurelius was not a Christian emperor. In fact, he was actually a very anti-Christian emperor. He was very much into Greek philosophy and all that sort of stuff. But many generations later mistook this sculpture of Marcus Aurelius as the Emperor Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor of Rome. And so they kept it. So, little historical irony there. This emperor who persecuted Christians, his is the only equestrian statue to remain because everybody thought it was a Christian emperor, Constantine. All right. Irony, irony, irony. Look at this sculpture really quickly, though. Look at the realism. Look at this, the muscles in the horse. Look at the expression of sort of contemplation and thoughtfulness on Marcus Aurelius's face. Look at the incredible detail in the clothing here. We are seeing sort of all of the inventions of Greek art. This realism, this naturalism, really being perfected by the Romans. Okay. So that wraps up this chapter. Next chapter we'll be moving on to see what happens later on in the Roman Empire, and we're going to watch it fall, and we're going to watch the rise of these new religions, Christianity and Islam, and we're going to see the world change a lot and get into a period called the Middle Ages. So you guys sit tight. It's about to get a lot of fun. I'll see you next time.